Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton, and once again, it's just me today. We have a listener survey available for any and all listeners to complete about the podcast. If you complete the survey, you will be entered into a drawing for a chainmail dice bag. I will have the survey up until the end of July, and then we'll do the drawing to see among the people who completed the survey who will be winning the dice bag. The survey is an opportunity for you all who listen to the podcast to let us know what you think about it, and if there's anything that you can think of that you would like done to improve the podcast. I would also like to thank the Wizards of the Coast Customer Service Department. I had a first printing of the Player's Handbook, and its binding was coming apart at the seams, and I emailed the Customer Service Department, sent them photos of the damaged book, and they replaced it for free. So, thank you very much, Wizards of the Coast. Finally, before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com, and that more right now is a link to the customer satisfaction survey. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you like our show and would like to help us with hosting costs, any help would be greatly appreciated. You can help us out at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So today's topic, I will be talking about how I personally prepare for running a setting and how I create a new setting. I'm going to start with talking about how I prepare for playing a setting in a campaign. There are several questions that I go over in my preparations. First, what is the setting? What is the essential thing that is in the setting that makes it special? I call this my research phase. During this time, I'm trying to immerse myself in the setting by reading about it until I feel very comfortable with the setting itself. I do this in order to learn or to remember what is necessary for me to get absolutely right about the setting in order to make it a fun experience and to make it a unique experience. If it's a published setting, I usually check out the recommended media section that is in nearly every single book. And I try to watch some of the TV shows or movies or do some reading about the things that served the authors of the setting as inspiration. And I try to use that to determine what sort of a vibe that the setting is trying to go for, and that I can then evoke whenever I'm trying to do my descriptions of things, the things that I really need to point out to the players whenever they are interacting with the world. So, for instance, if I'm gearing up to do like a Star Wars game, I will rewatch the original Star Wars trilogy. If I'm going to be running a Call of Cthulhu game, I try to watch the movie In the Mouth of Madness. If it's a medieval game, I try to watch Lord of the Rings. For it's like Traveler, I try to watch like Firefly, Star Trek again, because I can never watch enough Star Trek. When I'm immersing myself in all of this media, I try to figure out what the tone, if there are any heavy themes that are in the work that I want to make sure that I put across to the players. Like Star Trek, they're all about exploration. They're all about seeking out and learning about the unknown. And then within each different series, you have different takes on the exploration theme. Like The Next Generation eventually gets into exploring the individual characters that are on the show, exploring what it means to be human, really getting into what an idealized version of humanity would be like. And then in Deep Space Nine, it's more an exploration of having established what all of the values of Starfleet are, of the pinnacle of humanity is, where those gray areas lie. Is it really true that these ideals are compatible with enemies that are ruthless and domineering in a way that is the opposite of the freedom and liberty that the Federation espouses. And to continue with the Star Trek analogy just a little bit further, this is where I start to figure out where this particular campaign is going to fit within the setting itself, what dials I'm going to be tuning in order to get a particular experience out of the game for the players. I'm choosing what themes and ideals I'm going to lean most heavily into for my game. And I'm also working on my pitch to my players to let them know that this idea that I have is going to be fucking cool, and I can't wait to run this game. And part of what is going to make this cool is going to be who the player characters are going to be in the greater scheme of the campaign setting. How are they going to be interacting with the different parts of the campaign setting itself? This is where I come up with the hook that I want to get the other players interested in playing the game. Because it's absolutely critical for me that the players are actually interested in the game itself. Nothing kills my enthusiasm for running a game faster than players who don't seem interested in what I'm pitching. I've said on previous episodes that my favorite D&D campaign setting is Planescape. Above all other properties that I love with all of my heart, like X-Men that I've loved since I was 9 years old, Star Trek that I've loved since I was 11, Planescape remains the game setting that I love to my core. I love so much about it. I love everything that the setting does. And yet there have been games that I have pitched and I have been absolutely crushed by my players whose faces go sour whenever I explain why I'm wanting to run this setting. And that needs to be something that a GM is prepared to deal with. The players not wanting to play in your setting. I really don't think it's fair for the game master to pitch a setting and the players to not be totally on board with it. If it's not going to be fun for the players, then that lack of fun, that lack of enthusiasm is going to come back on the game master. And in the worst case scenario, that might make you a little bit bitter toward this system that you love being just met with that apathy and disinterest. So at this point, I've only invested time into what I want to run. If the players aren't happy with it, then fine. I have wasted some time watching some movies that I love, reading some books that I love, reading up on a campaign setting that I love. I don't feel like there's any major loss if the players aren't wanting to play what I'm wanting to run. But if I can spark that enthusiasm, if I can catch a glimpse of a player's eyes lighting up whenever I mention something about the setting that I want to have in the game. And it's not every single player that I'm trying to get this enthusiastic about. I realize that that's not going to happen. You're not going to always have every single player going, yes, I definitely want to play this game, because I know I do not get that excited about things, and several other people in my current group and in my groups in general just don't express that level of excitement about anything. But if I've read the room and people seem on board, at this point I'll start thinking about, well, what are the rules that I'm going to be using? If it's a Dungeons and Dragons setting, and going back to Planescape again, it's an out-of-print setting that was written for a completely different edition. Which edition am I going to run this in? If I'm adapting it to a different edition than what it was written for, do I need to change anything about the edition that I am going to run in order to make it fit the feel, the tone, the themes of the original campaign setting? I feel like this is probably one of the most critical parts of the planning process because the rules are going to affect how the game is played, what is possible within the game. For most of my games, I usually already have the system decided by the time I select what setting I'm going to play. In a lot of game settings, the rules and the setting are pretty intertwined, but there are plenty of instances where I have run, again, Planescape in other settings other than D&D. I ran a Savage Worlds Planescape game. I'm sure that most of us who were introduced into this hobby through Dungeons and Dragons, but then expanded out to other game systems, I'm sure that there was a point in time where you tried to adapt the Dungeons and Dragons rule system for other game settings that it's simply not designed for, and had pretty lackluster results in trying to adapt the rules into a genre that it simply is not built well to emulate. For instance, horror. There was a D20 version of Call of Cthulhu made back in the early 2000s that did a fairly decent job of converting the D20 rule system, which was what D&D 3rd edition was built on. It tried to make a horror game out of it, and quite literally it just lifted a portion of the Chaosium percentile system wholesale from the Call of Cthulhu basic rule system and plopped it down into D20. So you've got the regular D20 system, but then with the sanity mechanics and madness mechanics, you're still using everything based on a percentile. The reason why I think it did a poor job of making a horror setting was that it betrayed the core mechanic of 3rd edition D&D, which is the D20 roll, and for an entire subsystem completely eliminated it. So I want not only for the rules to be a good fit for the setting, I also want the rules to be consistent with themselves. So if I have to decide which system I'm going to be running a game in, I try to look at which system is going to require the least amount of modification in order for me to get the results that I want. And usually I don't want to go out and learn a whole new system for a setting that I am adapting. If it's a setting that has its own rule system along with it, I'm fine with learning a completely new set of rules. Like whenever we played Eclipse Phase, I was fine with reading that huge tome to try to understand what the rules for the system were, because the rules and the setting were created together and designed to go together. But if I'm adapting a setting that doesn't have a rule system with it, say for instance I was to run a Harry Potter game, since there are no official campaign settings for the Harry Potter universe, then I would need to look at what game systems fit it the best. But sometimes I just want to try out a setting in a system it wasn't made for, just to see how it works. That's the main reason why I ran Planescape in the Savage Worlds system a few years ago. Without the regular D&D magic system, a lot of things were changed. I felt like I lost a lot of the flavor of that setting. So it's probably not anything I'm going to be running again in the future. But that's part of DMing. That's part of the experimentation of getting to know rules and systems and settings and learning how to recognize when something is going to be a good fit and when it is not. Because I thought Savage Worlds would be a pretty good fit for what I saw Planescape being. But in actual play, I think that since the game was built around D&D, it only makes sense to convert that into other D&D editions. I might try to do it in other high fantasy game systems that are specifically emulating to some degree what D&D does. For instance, I might try it in Dungeon World at some point, because Dungeon World is a Powered by the Apocalypse game that relies on remaking a lot of the standard Dungeons and Dragons tropes and classes and races and making a more narrative game with story-based mechanics. But we'll just have to see. It would require quite a bit of tweaking to the base dungeon world system in order to get some of the things that I would want out of a Planescape game. But I would want a little bit more experience with the Powered by the Apocalypse system before I even attempted to adapt it to something that it isn't inherently built toward. I personally like to try my hardest not to use any rules modifications the first time that I run a game system. I firmly believe that you cannot truly know if a game system works until you've played it as written. And I also firmly believe that if you're going to be changing the system, you absolutely owe it to your players to make them aware of the changes before they make their characters. Whenever I game master, I always give the players some sort of printout or put on display somewhere the rules modifications that I am going to be doing before we start a campaign setting. There are few things that infuriate me more than learning about a rules change literally seconds before I am attempting to make a roll, especially if it's a game system that I know fairly well. Like if we are playing Dungeons and Dragons and I'm going to try to make a trip attack against an enemy, being told right before I make that trip attack, oh, well, the game master has decided that they're going to be running slightly different rules for tripping, especially if I've built my character around doing combat tricks and things like that. And in case you are wondering, yes, I have been burned on character concepts because rules modifications happened that I was not aware of until I went to do the thing that my character was built to do and was told it doesn't work that way anymore. And the reason why it pisses me off is because it's changing the player's expectation of what they're going to be getting out of the game. And that changes the amount of control that a player feels over their character. I pride myself in getting to know the game systems that I run and that I play in, because the rules for your particular character are literally the only way in which you interact with the world. The only way that you have any control over the world is over your own character. And to find out, usually at the most inopportune time, that you don't have as much control as what you thought you did, it's infuriating to me. I don't have a problem with it if these changes are spelled out ahead of time. I am fine with running and playing in a heavily modified system as long as I am told ahead of time what I'm in for. I'm even fine playtesting game systems whenever the person running the game tells the players at the very beginning of the game, hey, I'm playtesting this rule set because it's not quite finished, so I might have to make some tweaks to it along the way. That's great. That's how games get better. But if we're running a published, established game system, and I don't know that the trip rules are different than what is published in the book, and I do not know that until 2 seconds before I roll my die, it feels arbitrary, and it feels like the game master is trying to take away my, as a player's, fun. That's how I have fun, by knowing what I can do and then deciding to go ahead and do it. Okay, I'm going to stop that little rant and go on to talking about how I create a brand new setting. So the initial questions that I ask myself are the same as whenever I'm just deciding if I'm going to be running an established setting. What is the setting? What are the essential things that I need to have for the setting? What makes this setting different from other source material? I look at what has inspired me to make this particular setting that I'm wanting to run? Is there something that has sparked this need to make a new setting that none of the other settings that I'm aware of quite fit what I am going for? I don't want to spend a lot of time creating a setting if it already exists, or very large portions of what I want to have in the game already exists in a setting I am already familiar with. And invariably, because nothing is new under the sun, there's going to be something that exists that is already fairly similar to it. But there are always going to be those little tweaks that make it just different enough that the original material doesn't quite fit my needs as much as I would like. I also start to bounce around the idea in my head of which game systems I'm going to be using for this particular setting. I've never had the itch to create a whole new game system, so that usually means that I'm going to be adapting some other game system that already exists. And so once again, I'm looking at what game systems fit what I'm wanting the best. In general, I lean toward more generic game systems that aren't tied down to a particular genre. And that's where I start. But sometimes it is more appropriate to do minor tweaks to an existing game system that is very genre specific if the game setting itself is already in that same genre. But this is still very preliminary. I usually don't tie myself down to a particular game system until relatively late in the decision-making process. After I've made a list of several game systems that I might be willing to run this in, I start to look at the pertinent history of this game world that I'm going to be running. Most of the time, whenever I'm creating a game world, a new game setting, it's usually fantasy in some degree, set in some quasi-historical time period, but also it could be sci-fi. I generally don't consider adapting a modern game to really be the same as creating a new setting, because modern is the modern setting. But having just said that, I can think of whenever I wanted to run an adaptation of the Planescape setting, only with roughly the equivalent to modern technology. So it was set in the same timeline as the regular D&D Planescape campaign setting, but it was set in a time where the technological advancement had advanced to roughly modern times. So if any of you are playing a drinking game, you can go ahead and take a drink, because immediately after making a definitive statement about something, I have thought of an exception that I myself have participated in. But anyway, back to creating the setting. I have an idea of what the setting is going to be, what makes it unique, what makes it special. I have a list of potential game systems that I might be running the setting in. So next I need to figure out what has gotten the world to the point where the game is going to start. What is the history? Because I'm a history buff, this is something that I put a lot of thought into. This is one of the reasons why I love making new settings, is thinking about the history, thinking about how people and events have shaped and molded the world into what it becomes. I also look at how technology has progressed. I feel like this is something that doesn't happen a lot in fantasy games. Sci-fi definitely has a lot of this, because that's one of the main points of sci-fi, is to see how technology has changed everything. But in fantasy, I see this going by the wayside all the time. In fantasy settings, technology doesn't change for millennia. The same weapons, the same armor being used for thousands of years. And this really ticks me off. Technology is never stagnant. Technology is always changing. Whether it's a golden age and technology is skyrocketing, or whether it is in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of a massive civilization, and technology is, or rather the knowledge of how to use and create technology is being lost because those people are simply dying off. Technology is always changing and always evolving, and it is always replaced by something. You're like either the Romans inventing the aqueduct system, or you are in the aftermath of the collapse of the Roman Empire and you are reverting back to wells and manually carrying water up from the stream. And I think part of the reason why this is so ignored is because in history, or rather in American high school history, we are taught about people and dates. Who did what and when. And that's how I see a lot of the histories of worlds being written. It's all about who did what and when. There's never a reflection of like cultural changes. You learn about Martin Luther King Jr. being a major part of the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. And that serves as a touchstone and a milestone because it is so hard to quantify a shift in cultural values over the course of 100 years where African Americans reach a closer to equal social status and social standing. It's hard to find a single place where we can point to in order to have a definitive date of when these changes make their impact fully known. Another factor in this cultural and technological stagnation is something that I see born more out of how history was represented in our own past before there really was this discipline of history as we know it in modern times, where modern day historians are looking back and trying to figure out what exactly it was like to live in a previous time period. Prior to the modern way of doing history, history was represented, particularly in art, as something that looked very contemporary to the artist who was rendering it. Artists during the late medieval and early Renaissance eras depicted Jesus as looking like a man from Italy or France or England around the time that the artist was working. And not only this, the weapons and the armor that were being used, like by David and Goliath, were contemporary to what was being used on the battlefield at the time. And this goes even back to the Iliad, where the depictions of these heroes who were ancient to the ancient Athenians were running around in bronze armor and using iron blades simply because Homer didn't know that those things hadn't been invented yet around the time when the Trojan War might have actually happened. And this is a trap that I try very, very hard to avoid falling into whenever I'm creating fantasy realms. If a player character is going to find an ancient sword that is magical, it's very likely that that ancient sword is going to be made of bronze and in the shape of a khopesh, or made of iron. It's going to be something that is clearly not contemporary in style and make to what is available at ye old blacksmith. Not everything that has ever existed in history is all going to be available at once in town for purchase. Anyways, back on topic, I'm going to try to focus a lot of my effort into the most recent and relevant parts of the past. I'm going to be pretty nitpicky with all of the little things that have happened within the past, generation in the world, but the further back in history of the setting, I'm going to go, the broader and broader the brushstrokes are going to be as to how I flesh that out. Because the most recent developments are the ones that have the most obvious through lines to things that are going on in the world at the time that the campaign starts. Like, I will think a lot more about the impact that, to use a modern day equivalent, the impact that 9/11 had in America is going to be reflected more in the current culture than the impact of the Vietnam War, and then the World War II would have even less of an impact. The American Civil War would have diminished, and then the Revolutionary War having even more diminished, and going back further and further and further, just seeing that those were important events and that they did have an impact, but it's going to be a lot harder to see how those directly impact how I think and feel today. Like, in history, the Battle of Marathon was a big fucking deal, but tracing the through line that explains how it impacts my life today is going to be a huge, long story that the vast majority of people just will not care about. So I try to focus on things that are actually going to have not only an impact in the game, but a relevance to the player characters in a way that the players even are going to care to learn. I mean, I love making these histories. I love writing them. I love thinking about them. I love playing out all of these little what-if scenarios in my mind. But when it comes to play, it's just not going to matter to the players or their characters. And ultimately, I'm going to try to pare this down to a few bullet points, definitely 10 or fewer, that's going to summarize the important history of the world to them, because that's all that most of the players are going to read. And if it's going to be important later, NPCs are going to hound them about it. Let's see. Religion. Almost completely forgot about religion. Something that has a major impact in the lives of billions of people is something that I almost forgot. And I probably almost forgot about it because that's, in my experience, it's almost always another one of those things that's kind of an afterthought. It gets maybe a line or two in most settings. Even in Dungeons and Dragons, where there are entire classes built around religion, you get a paragraph about a particular god and absolutely no context as to how that impacts the lives of the people in the world. And that's probably one of the things that has the most impact in the day-to-day lives of most people. This is the quickest way to convey a lived-in feel for the setting that you are creating, is to have aspects of religion that are having impacts in day-to-day life. Having days that are holy days, holidays, or Sabbaths, or days when people go to temple or church and have special prayers that they say before special meals or before every meal. It can really be used as a shorthand of explaining what are the most important things in people's lives, and have that be reflected in the way that they engage in their faith or don't engage in their faith. It makes it a lot more impactful if some people are very religious and they adhere to observances and rituals in ways that varies from person to person, and not only on the individual level, but how that or those, depending on the setting, how that or those religions impact not only the minutia of daily life, but also direct the culture as a whole. All right, this is going to be another short episode. I've got two geek things this time. The first is going to be a website / developing app called Crawler. This is like Tinder or Grindr, but it is specifically for role players to find other role players to be in their games. It's spelled CRAWLR. There will be links in the show notes. And also, just something that I got a big kick out of. There is a commercial that you can watch on YouTube for I'm not sure what language it's in. I want to say it's probably Spanish or probably Portuguese. I'm not quite sure. But it is a car commercial for the Renault Outsider. And it features a live action adaptation of the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon from the 1980s. If you're familiar with the cartoon, you'll definitely get a kick out of this car commercial. Okay, that's it. So, thank you for listening. And I think it's time for me to stop this bullshit and start getting to work on my campaign. Thanks. This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.